Hey everybody, welcome back to the Space Between. As you know, my name is Cole. Today we are starting a new series. It's going to be a bigger series. There's a lot to cover here. And I'll just kind of give you an insight into podcasting, which maybe you're not aware of, and maybe I wasn't fully aware of, is that when you start researching something um, that you're interested in and want to kind of podcast, it's amazing how many things need room to breathe. And maybe it's because we're coming at it from like not a place of sensationalism, but a place of like really delving in and finding out like the past, the center, and the end of it, and really what we do in the center as a frame of mind and a frame of reference. But so many topics are like, oh man, I need to break this up. This is heavy, and the series on addiction is just that. There's a lot to cover, and there's like little rabbit holes that come up, especially in this first segment. There were like some things that I was like, whoa, we have to cover that in a whole different um, podcast, not even in the series, but just in a whole different podcast because it's like this subset of what comes out of the addiction culture. And so it's been really interesting and something that I didn't anticipate when I first started doing podcasts, that there would be so many things where I'd be like, man, I'm learning a lot of information. I hope you guys are too. And I hope that we're able to really dig deep into the subject of addiction and what we can do with it from a center perspective. So, here we go. When we talk about drugs and America's relationship with them, we have to be honest. They were here before we were. The Native Americans who lived on this land long before our boats pulled ashore used psychoactive plants like peyote in spiritual and healing context. Now, these uses were mostly structured, communal, and not framed as addiction. It's super important. During the Civil War, morphine was the drug of choice for battlefield wounds, and many soldiers became dependent on it. That was as early as the 1800s. I mean, as you can imagine, when you're getting shot with muskets and stuff like that, those wounds are pretty serious, and you want some good pain meds for that. Even before that, though, 60 to 75% of America's 60 to 75% of Americans addicted to morphine or opium were women. Why? They weren't getting shot on battlefields, right? It was because doctors routinely prescribed it for female complaints. And when those addictions took hold, alcohol was often prescribed as the treatment. Not because it cured anything, but because it dulled the symptoms of the addiction. One addiction traded for another. By the late 1800s, cocaine and heroin entered the scene, marketed as non-addictive and even safe for children's teething pain. What we now call street drugs or highly addictive substances didn't come from the sketchy underground. They came from the medical community. Addiction wasn't smuggled into America. It was handed to her by her doctors. So, between 1850 and 1880, Chinese immigrants came to the U.S. chasing the dream of the gold rush and as recruited labor for the Central Pacific Railroad. They did the most dangerous and underpaid work, including blasting tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. They were essential until they weren't. When the railroads were completed in 1869, those same Chinese laborers began taking up more desirable jobs in agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. And they were willing to work for less than the white laborers. And I know you're like, Cole, did you mess up and put this information with the addiction podcast? No, I didn't. Because what you're about to find out is that drug use is about to become partially illegal. So, Chinese laborers come in, they work for the railroads, doing the dangerous jobs, blowing holes in the sides of mountains for our railroads to go through. Then, when the railroads are completed, they start taking more desirable, safer jobs that more white people would have. And then the narrative starts to shift. Their visibility grew, their communities expanded, and anti-Chinese sentiment exploded. Enter the Opium Exclusion Act of 1909, the first federal drug prohibition. It didn't ban opium, it banned smoking opium, the form associated with Chinese immigrants. The pharmaceutical version, still legal, still prescribed, still protected. And here's where the story turns. Because the Opium Exclusion Act wasn't about public health, it wasn't even about addiction, it was about visibility. The form of opium used in Chinese communities, smoked, communal, cultural, became criminal. The form used in white households, prescribed, private, pharmaceutical, stayed legal. Same drug, different story. This is the moment addiction stopped being a medical condition and started being a legal identity. Not because the substance changed, but because the user did. America has a habit of criminalizing the hands that built her. She welcomes the work, but not the worker. And we're not going to ignore that. We're going to give it the space it deserves in a following episode. Totally different subject matter than addiction. But for now, we're staying here with addiction, with the way it's been shaped, criminalized, and misunderstood, not just by policy, but by our very culture. So the shift. The shift began in 1906 when morphine, heroin, cocaine, and cannabis had to be labeled as potentially dangerous. Middle and upper class consumers, many of whom who had been unknowingly taking opiate-laced products, saw the labels and stopped buying. Products like Coca-Cola and Miss Winslow's soothing syrup had been sold as everyday remedies marketed for nerves, digestion, teething pain, and fatigue. Before this point, there were no real laws regulating these medicines, so pharmaceutical companies and small-town pharmacists could just sell them over the counter without a doctor's involvement. Relief was packaged as medicine, and addiction was packaged as trust. And here's where you start to see the class divide. When 33% of sales dried up in wealthier markets because middle and upper class consumers had access to doctors, prescriptions, and alternatives, the lower and working class were left behind. They had already become dependent on the over-the-counter remedies that they could afford, the ones they trusted, the ones they didn't know were addictive. The labels didn't change their access, they just changed how the government saw them. In 1914, the laws would change again, requiring a prescription or branding you a criminal. So, let's balance this out. For over 114 years, America allowed and essentially encouraged addiction across her population. Then, she criminalized it for those who couldn't afford doctors. Not only that, she criminalized the treatment of addiction. Doctors were prosecuted, clinics were shut down. America didn't just criminalize addiction, she criminalized recovery. And the people who needed help the most were left with handcuffs and not healing. Addiction stopped becoming a medical condition, it became a criminal identity. By 1922, there were 0 treatment centers available for addiction. 0. Instead of being given treatment by the same government that had perpetrated their addiction, they were arrested, prosecuted, sentenced, and imprisoned. In 1929, the government saw the problem of overcrowded prisons and passed the Narcotic Farms Act, not to offer care, but to contain the consequences. So basically what's happening here is that America allows these substances that are highly addictive into its mass population for 114 years, and then all of a sudden decides, hey, you can't have those anymore. It's illegal. So the wealthy, when we talk about that 33% sales decline once those labels came in, what that tells you is that addiction isn't ideal, right? So once you slap a label on something that says it's highly addictive, people who have alternatives for those remedies are going to go to their doctor and say, hey, I want something that's not as addictive. I want something that, is safer to use for my children's teething, blah, 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 right? Common sense. But if you don't have access to doctors, if you don't have the money to finance that, then you're kind of in this loop, and that's what's happening here. So it becomes criminalized. They start arresting a bunch of people. Oh man, we don't have room in our prisons for these people. So we're going to pass this narcotics farm act. So that's kind of where we are right now. So basically what that is it's two prison hospital hybrids that were built in the country. One was built in Lexington, Kentucky. The other was built in Fort Worth, Texas. But they wouldn't open for another 6 to 9 years respectively. These facilities, they weren't like voluntary rehab centers. In fact, even those people who volunteered for treatment, they weren't free to leave. They were studied, tested, and confined, like lab rats in a federal experiment. A repeal of these farms would be part of the Public Health Service Act of 1944. Not because of the experimentation taking place, but because of restructuring and a shift of public health priorities and a political discomfort with hybrid institutions because they blurred the lines between prison and hospital punishment and treatment and justice and public health. Right? So basically what was happening was the public health sector was like, we don't really want to be in with this whole prison deal. It's complicated and messy, and are we running a prison? Are we running an experimental lab? What are we doing here? And so the repeal happens. But interestingly enough, the repeal didn't close the narcotic farms. Oh, sorry. They repealed the act that created these two farms, and then they repeal it, and the farms don't close. All it did was it just erased their legal foundation, leaving behind institutions that weren't fully prison, weren't fully hospitals, and weren't fully authorized. Those two prisons / hospitals, they kept operating for 31 more years. 31 years to shut them down. Not because they were effective, but because the government had nowhere else to put addicted people. A conservative estimate says that over 100,000 people, an entire generation of people, passed through those two narco farms and had their government experiment on them with no cure to show for their lives or for the experimentation by the time they were rebranded in 1975. Imagine 100,000 people get experimented on in these hybrid buildings for over 31 years. No cures. 100,000 people. So in 1975, they are they're not shut down, they're just rebranded. Because again, that's what we do. We rebrand things, much like the addiction that America had created to begin with. Every time the system broke, it wasn't dismantled, it was just renamed, repackaged, and kept going. And what we're talking about there is the fact that, like, addiction was okay if you weren't Chinese, and then it was okay if you were warned, and then it was definitely not okay, and then it was recovery is also not okay. It's a very interesting system that we created around addiction. And when we talk about an entire generation of people, we're talking about tens of thousands of people who were criminalized for a medical condition. People who were studied, confined, and experimented on instead of cared for. A population who lived through decades of policy that treated addiction as deviance. Individuals who were denied dignity, autonomy, and healing. Not just once, but systematically. And when you look at those people, like we said, we saw that 33% of the wealthy people stopped buying the addictive substances and went to their doctors for alternate prescriptions. So when you look at these people that this did affect, these narco farms affected, these jails affected, this prison time affected, this long-term addiction affected, many of them were poor, were black, brown, or immigrant, or had no access to private doctors or legal prescriptions. They were caught in a system that created their addiction and punished their survival. It's not just about the time that they spent. So you're a generation of people, 100,000 people went through those farms. It's about a shared experience. People who were shaped by the same laws, lived through the same betrayals, were processed by the same institutions, were erased by the same silence. And many of them never got out, not just physically, but emotionally, socially, and economically. So, like I said at the beginning of this episode, like when I think about um, addiction, I think it affects everyone. And we're going to get so much deeper into that, into the reality of addiction and how everybody has a vice, right? And so we're going to, like I said, we're going to talk much more about that in coming episodes on Thursday nights. But this particular the research for how addiction started in America was a little overwhelming for my brain. Like I actually had to walk away a couple times and just really sit with what I was learning, because really, like, the things that America did in her infancy, and maybe still does to her people, is it's harmful, and it's a little mind-blowing. And so, like I said, these episodes, we could go a little longer. We could go 30 minutes to an hour and kind of cram things in. But I think when we deal with hard things like that, I don't think we need to stack them on top of each other. I think we need to sit with them and really think about what that means intentionally, individually, so we can come to terms with it and then move forward into the next piece of the story. And in the next episode, we are going to move forward. We're going to stop talking about the laws on paper. We're going to stop talking about how addiction was created in America. And we're going to talk about the people, because addiction isn't just a policy failure, it's the human story. And if we want to understand what addiction is, then we have to understand what it feels like, what it does to families, to memory, to identity, and hope. So I hope you guys hung in there. I know that was kind of a little bit of information to go through, and some of it might have been a little heavy for you to kind of wrap your brain around if you're like me, and are a little overwhelmed with some of the things that we as a country have done. So I would just encourage you to sit with it, kind of think about it, think about what you can do with it from your center place. For me, it's just, I'm educating myself on this, I'm seeing the problem, and I hope to never be a part of that problem. I hope to be more part of the solution. And so, anyway, I hope you guys will join me here next Thursday as we begin to really delve into the people that addiction affects. All right, I'll see you guys next Thursday. Bye.